it gives me great pleasure to be here today with Mishal Husain, and I would like to congratulate her on her most recent award. She's received many, but the most recent one is the Charles Wheeler Award for Outstanding Contribution to Journalism. She's been a presenter for the BBC Four's Today programme for 11 years and is now launching a new interview show for Bloomberg this year. She began her BBC career as a producer in 1998, became a presenter in the BBC World News in 2001, and reporting on location from different countries, from the United States, Middle East, South Asia, Singapore, and China. In 2014, she was the first journalist to enter the school attacked by the Taliban in Peshawar. In 2014, her engagement interview with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was seen around the world. Her many documentaries include a series on Mahatma Gandhi, the Arab uprising of 2017, Malala Yousafzai, and The Longest Reign, a two-part series on Queen Elizabeth II. And in 2024, she presented election debates for the BBC. She was born in Britain to parents of Pakistani origin, moved with them to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and went to school in England, where she now lives. But she frequented her grandparents in Pakistan. She received degrees from Cambridge University and the European University Institute of Florence. And it seems that her interest in journalism began as an internship when she was 18 in Rawalpindi with the news under the editorship of Maliha Lodhi.
I'm laughing because she was a very frightening editor, as I don't hesitate to tell her today, but a very brilliant woman then and now.
Yes, she's amazing. Anyways, it's a wonderful link. In 2020, Mishal wrote The Skills How to Win at Work, which draws on her own experience and has been described as the ultimate handbook for women. Now she has written an amazing family memoir, Broken Threads, which is what we will be discussing today. Its full title is Broken Threads, My Family from Empire to Independence, and it reconstructs the respective lives of her grandparents. Sayyid Shahid Hussain, who belonged to Lucknow and married Tahira Bhatt from Aligarh, Dr. Mumtaz Hussain, sorry, I meant Dr. Sayyid Shahid Hamid, I do apologize for that. Dr. Mumtaz Hussain from Multan, who married Mary Quinn from Anarkale in South India. And so she moves across from colonial to post-colonial times, and she not only takes us across undivided India into family history, but then she spans the independence movement, the Pakistan movement, partition, and builds in World War II, in which both her grandfathers served. Sayyid Shahid Hamid as an army officer, and her grandfather, Dr. Mumtaz Hussain, as an army, or rather an Air Force doctor, as he was then. The book begins with a wonderful introduction on how and why Mishal wrote this book, and then it's divided into three sections. Part 1, Citizens of Empire, Part 2, Before Midnight, and Part 3, After Midnight. And it's a most beautifully structured work which focuses on the life of each of the four protagonists, into which he seamlessly supplements personal family stories and a well-informed and well-researched historical and political background, which incorporates actually the Indian Mutiny, the acquisition of English by Indian Muslims, the Hindu-Muslim divide, and indeed the interaction with the British. to give further context to personal lives. And then, of course, it moves on, as I've said before, to partition. What is more unusual is that into this narrative, she blends in the present the glimpses of her own life, which give context to her research, and the materials that she draws on, including personal memories and conversations, as well as the discovery of memoirs, letters, photographs, and audio tapes, and indeed historical accounts. Here are some quotes from reviews she's received. This is Geeta Doctor from The Hindu, who says, "At times, Mishal Husain's stories float across the page like a chartreuse shawl etched with light." And this is Victoria Schofield, who is with us today. I think she has a parallel session. And Victoria's wrote, "It takes true dedication to write about one's family. And for a journalist with Mishal Husain's high profile, visible on British television screens and audible on the radio, perhaps doubly so. By discovering the lives of her 4 grandparents, she has gone back in time to chart their experience against the backdrop of one of the most traumatic and momentous events of 20th century South Asian history, the partition of India and the creation of 2 dominions, India and Pakistan. Mishal Husain paints a wonderfully vivid portrait as she pieces together their individual stories." And in Dawn, Nasreen Rahman wrote, "BBC broadcaster Mishal Husain's magnificent chronicle, Broken Threads, defies categorization. It is a bittersweet story of love, loss, and recovery. And Husain's prose has the same stylistic poise and biting clarity as her speech. The result is an unputdownable book." I'm now going to ask Mishal to please read some extracts.
Thank you very much, Muneeza Khala. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. This is only the second time that I'm talking about this book in Pakistan, and the first and only time I'll be talking about it in Karachi. And I'm in the presence of some people who knew those who became characters in this book. My 2 grandmothers, Tahira and Mary, feature on the front cover in a way that would have astounded both of them. So I know that some of you here will have your deep connections through your own family histories to the events I write about. And what I want to say at the outset is that while I took my inspiration in thinking of my 4 grandparents as part of a generation who were the founding generation of Pakistan and independent India, not in a leadership position because they were too young at the time in their 20s and 30s, but certainly the generation that built new countries. And when I thought about their lives, I realized that this extraordinary span of events in the 20th century world history, whether it was the First World War and the creation of new countries in the Middle East, for example, after the First World War, or the period of the 30s, and then, of course, the Second World War, often their lives were affected by events that were far away from their own experience. And so as I set out, initially thinking this is a story of social mobility, of primarily Muslims, but other communities as well, finding a way for themselves in the Raj and in colonial India, I then realized that I had to go further back in time and to really understand this generation in the context of when they were born in the early 20th century, the mutiny or First War of Independence was still within living memory. And according to that, people made decisions on acquiring English as a language, on the professions that they would enter. And yet then within their lifetimes, they found themselves citizens of independent countries in a way that I think they would not have imagined in their growing up years. My grandmother Tahira, who grew up in Aligarh, would visit Delhi to see the sights at the time when New Delhi was still being built. The city of New Delhi was not inaugurated until 1931 as the grand new capital of British India. And 16 years later, British India is completely gone. So while it is the story of 4 people, and therefore my family, I'd also think of it as the story of countless families, including, I'm sure, many, if not all of yours. So there was something that my grandmother Tahira said in tapes that my mother had the foresight to record, which I think made me think this could be a generational story. she said, in certain ways, people of my generation were not complete for a long time. We were used to a pattern of life, friends that we had made and kept, despite prejudices of life like religion. But these things don't really matter. The human values do. So she was writing essentially about growing up in a diverse society in pre-independence British India, and then about what they left behind. So perhaps I can just briefly give you a portrait, a pen portrait of the four individuals whose lives I used as the starting point for this book. And I'll start with my grandmother Mary. I was conscious as I began this book is that I think perhaps unusually my four grandparents spanned a great swathe, geographical swathe of what was British India. My grandfather Mumtaz, my dada, was born in Multan. He married my grandmother Mary, who was from a small town called Anakapali. It's on the eastern seaboard of India in present-day Andhra Pradesh, between Calcutta and what was then Madras and is now Chennai, but really a very long way from both of those places. She was an Anglo-Indian, a devout Catholic all her life. They had a cross-religious marriage. And then my mother's parents, Shahid and Tahira, came from the heart of what in their day was the United Provinces and is today the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh, Lucknow and Aligarh. But even then, their social circumstances were slightly different. So I felt that between the four of them, there was a story that was relatively wide and had wide significance. 3 Muslims, 1 Christian. And they all had different circumstances they were born into. And in my grandmother's Mary's life, she was born into relatively comfortable circumstances, but then her father died in a tragic accident when she was 13. And I'll just read a little bit about that because this was related to me by her surviving sibling, my great aunt Anne, who is now 100 years old, God bless her, and very much still with us. So she wrote about the night that their father died in 1933. He was of Irish descent, Francis Quinn. They were living in their country house. It was the month of June, and because of the heat, the family slept outside on a pindal or raised platform set a little way away from the cottage. It had a simple wooden frame with open sides and coconut palm leaves draped over the top, which were kept damp so that any gust of air became cooler as it passed through. There was a cradle on the ground, Anne told me. I don't know why it was on the ground. Usually it was hung on long iron chains from the top of the veranda, and the baby could be rocked in it that way. She remembered seeing her mother sitting down, feeding the baby, while Francis tried to get the 3-year-old into bed. Joe, the 3-year-old, ran between the 2 wooden beds where the cradle was. Daddy was chasing him and tripped and fell, and one of the big wooden knobs of the cradle hit him in his chest. He collapsed to the ground. I knew he had hurt himself badly, Anne told me, because I will never forget it. He didn't cry out. He couldn't breathe, and we didn't know what was wrong with him. They tried to get him up off the floor, but his size and weight made it difficult. Mary and Mummy and I, it took all 3 of us to get him into a chair, like a deck chair, and that was where he stayed, in a kind of camp chair, all night, all the next day, and until the morning of the day after that. 3 days later, Francis Quinn died, and as you can all imagine, the death of a parent in early life generally severely affects the life chances of the children. The Quinn children were relatively lucky because they were convent educated, and the nuns of their convent kept them in school, which allowed them to complete their education. And when she was 18, my grandmother Mary went all the way across India to Mayo Hospital in Lahore to train as a nurse, and that is where she met my grandfather Mumtaz, who was there as a medical student. So Mumtaz's life, he was born into a conservative middle-class home in the old city of Multan, and he left an extraordinary unpublished record of his life. And I'm so grateful that my chacha, my uncle Mickey, who's here today, saved this document from my grandfather's computer when he died. And had you not done that, Mickey Chacha, I would not have had this incredible resource which I drew upon. Thank you, certainly on behalf of myself, because it made this book possible, but also on behalf of many others. And when, I remember my grandfather tapping away on the computer and writing this record, and I'm ashamed to say at the time, I showed very little interest in it. And it made me really ashamed when I subsequently read it, because he writes right at the beginning, I don't know if anyone in my family is at all interested in what I'm writing, but I'm going to put it down anyway. But one of the things he writes early on is imagining his own birth in July 1920. Because, as you'll all know, Multan is a very punishing place in the summer heat, and it was exactly in that period he was born. The month of July is not reputed for inspiring poetic outpouring in our part of the world, he says in his memoir, a fact that seems to have bothered him. There was literature celebrating the blossoming of spring, the coming of the monsoon, or the cool of autumn, but July was, he said, a month of in-between ordinariness that fails to stimulate the imagination. Giving birth at that time of year would have been hard on his mother, he knew. The house had no electricity, and all she had to counter the heat was a block of ice placed nearby so that cooler air might be fanned in her direction. There was nothing to relieve pain. Everyone was fearful because a previous baby had been lost at a late stage. The sufferings of my poor mother can only be imagined, Mumtaz wrote. The stifling heat of Multan, the crowding in of relations, servants, and hangers-on, the latter desiring to be in on the event and then rushing off to spread the news. And what I loved about this was that he was a man, and yet he was able to imagine what a woman goes through in childbirth, especially with the privations of that point in time. So, Mumtaz and Mary. Let me turn then to Shahid and Tahira. So, my grandfather Shahid was born into relatively comfortable circumstances in the city of Lucknow. His grandmother, his nani, had a small taluqa, an estate. And on the basis of that, he and his brother Mahmood went to a very privileged school in Lucknow, although their circumstances were very different to many of the others who attended the same school. And he left a wonderful description of his class fellows, which I think gives you an idea of that place and time. In many ways, your aunt Atiya Hussain captured this same world in sunlight on a broken column. So Shahid and his brother must have been admitted to the school on the basis of their grandmother's small landholding, but their circumstances were entirely different to those of their peers. The ones who came from the richest landowning families had stables, not only for horses, but for elephants, and garages for cars, which were becoming the ultimate status symbol. This was in the 1920s. This was despite a lack of roads to drive them on or mechanics to maintain them. Shahid said a fleet of cars was often described as containing a certain number of runners, which meant functional vehicles, and non-runners, although the latter were never sold, as this would imply the owners were in need of money. The more substantial estates even had what he described as little private armies, equipped with matchlock guns, swords, and spears, dressed in the livery of their masters. At school, the sons of such families were usually accompanied by servants who carried their books from one class to the next and held sun umbrellas over their heads outdoors. Unlike Shahid and Mahmood, who knew they needed to do well at school in order to earn a living one day, the landowners' sons tended to have little aptitude for lessons or even interest in them. At exam time, many simply disappeared to their estates, knowing that they had little chance of passing the exams. So Shahid then went to Aligarh Muslim University, which had recently become a university. That happened in 1920, in the year of my grandmother's birth. And this university, which was founded by Sir Syed College as Sir Syed Ahmad Khan as a college, was a great bond between my mother's parents, because Shahid knew that the university at Aligarh gave him so much of the grounding in life. And my grandmother Tahira had grown up in this very emancipated environment where everyone was essentially everyone she knew was working at the university and was engaged in the pursuit of learning. She was the youngest of three sisters. There were two brothers as well. And she certainly had opportunities as a single woman, which her older sisters, Amina and Nagin, did not have. So Amna Majid Malik, whose son Farid is here, became later one of the great educators of Karachi, founding the PCHS Girls' School. But she was married young, whereas my grandmother Tahira was able to go as a single woman to medical school in Delhi, to Lady Harding. And in the tapes she left behind, I could hear a sense of wonder in her voice as she spoke of the Aligarh of her youth and had an excuse to travel back in time. I think the great contribution of Aligarh was the simplicity and elegance of life and the feeling of brotherhood, she said. There was total respect for one who deserved it, not for rank, wealth, or anything else. No one thought in terms of money, and no one missed it. Like Shahid, who experienced Aligarh as a student, Tahira also saw it as a place which prized community spirit, considering it to be as important as individual excellence. There was a duty society which gathered contributions towards bursaries, and the governing body was always looking out for alumni or other supporters with specialist skills. In an earlier time, Shahid's engineer grandfather Jafar used his annual leave to oversee the construction of new buildings on campus. So I'll stop there, Muneeza Khala, but essentially, this was a generation, this was a time where Muslims were really thinking about education and advancement because they were conscious that the middle class amongst the Muslims was still emerging. At that time, there were few role models of professional people, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah was one of those few examples of someone who was a professional man and well known in India as a Muslim.
Indeed, and Miss Jinnah became a dentist. He
Yes.
sent his sister to school.
And that was absolutely, Fatima Jinnah was also a role model. Here was a Muslim woman who was never in parda in her life.
Yes,
And that was
absolutely.
still a very unusual thing. We're talking about the early part of the 20th century.
That's true. And, well, even in post-war England, not many women became doctors.
Absolutely. Well, I was conscious that even my university in Cambridge, at the time that my grandmother Thyra was in the process of getting a degree from Lady Harding, actually the degrees were awarded by Punjab University and King Edward Medical College at the time. The two were linked. But she was on the way to getting a degree at a time when my own university was not awarding
Yes.
degrees to women.
No, it's quite interesting the kind of developments in India related to what was happening in the colonial power, actually, which they don't really. What I actually wanted to begin with was these worlds are so different from the one that you grew up in, and I mean, how did you kind of get into the book? What led you to enter into this family memoir?
Well, I knew that because I grew up as an expat child, primarily in Abu Dhabi, where my father was a doctor. I think Pakistan was incredibly important to me. It was the one place where it was like a fixed point in my life where we came on our holidays. And I was very attached to both sets of grandparents. And I knew that these stories were part of their life. And perhaps Thyra was the one who told me the most about her early life. We spent a lot of time together, and later also with my Dada Mumtaz. So I felt these stories were part of my life, but it took me a long time to really think that I not only I could write about them, but I should write about them, and I had a duty to write about them. And partly that was because of my work. My work has taken me to India many times.
Yes.
That's access that no one else in my family have had. Few Pakistanis have, few British Pakistanis have for that matter. And so I felt I had a broader understanding of the places where those three of my grandparents who were born in what is now India were born into. And also in my work as a British journalist, so much of my work on the Today program and on the BBC was about the questioning people in power in Britain. And the more I thought about the circumstances in which Britain gave up power in India, the more I thought was what a bizarre set of circumstances these were.
Indeed,
How much power was vested in very few hands, really just in the hands of the Viceroy, Louis Mountbatten, in a way that, where were the controls and the checks and balances? And I knew that decisions made at that time, affected my grandparents' lives and many of your family's lives very directly. The rush to independence and partition, the absolute chaos of that time. And I felt that what started off as a story of 4 people and 1 family, in a way became a much more political and historical story because I wanted to join all the dots. And that meant I started even before the First World War, but I've written about the Khilafat movement and about the period of non-cooperation, which was a joint enterprise between Hindus and Muslims, and which people like Muhammad Ali Johar, so much forgotten by history, was working alongside Gandhi. Muhammad Ali Jinnah at the time was deeply against what they were doing in non-cooperation. He thought it was a recipe for disorder, and it was absolutely the wrong thing to do. And then, of course, the Second World War, the immense service of India and families in today's Pakistan in that period, and then the 2 years between 1945 and 1947. My grandfather Shahid saw that period up close in Delhi. My other grandparents, Mumtaz and Mary, were also living in Delhi at the time of independence. And but I think what Shahid and Tara particularly saw, because he was working directly for Field Marshal Auchinleck, who was the last British commander in chief of the Indian Army, was absolutely crucial because Auchinleck and Mountbatten, and remember, these were the two most important officials of British India, the Viceroy and the Commander in Chief of the Indian Army, were absolutely at odds with how Britain should leave India. And Auchinleck put his thoughts on the record, wrote to the India office and the Attlee government in London saying, this timetable does not make sense. I'm very worried about the effect it's going to have on the army. You are dividing the army at the same time as you are asking the army to maintain law and order as people cross borders. And none of his warnings were heeded. So there's a historical record. I consulted papers in the British government archives, but I also had these personal accounts. And I guess I've brought all of those together. And I will say this was a labor of love. Often I would come off air at the BBC at 9 o'clock in the morning, having gone to work at 4, and I would sit in the British Library and I would consult the archives, and I would try and marry the official sources with what my grandparents were writing and saying about their experience of the times. So I did pour my heart and soul into this book, and I think it is personal and political and historical, and I hope that that's how people absorb it.
Well, it is indeed all that. And on a personal note, I have to say, like she was mentioning, when I was reading you this book, I had an entire alternative family story running through my head. You know, she'd mention a place or a name, and I'd remember some family story about that. You know, it was. But what interests me is before you started this book, you had actually made films on Mahatma Gandhi. You'd done a series. You had done a documentary, I think, on World War II. How did these, when you entered into these scenarios, how did they influence you? Because they're not known in Britain. And how did that then shape your narrative?
I think it's certainly in the last 5-7 years, there has been a lot more awareness. And this is not just to do with British Indians and British Pakistanis, but the British establishment more generally. There's much more awareness, certainly, of the contribution of our forefathers in the Second World War. And it's a matter of record that the Second World War couldn't have been won without the contribution of the Indian Army. And you know, so many of us have families who were affected by that turn of events. So I think in a way, these fragments of stories that crept into my life as a broadcaster and a journalist, all these fragments were swirling around, and I did start to think, okay, I need to put, and it's my duty to put all of them together. And the Second World War has such salience in Britain, such continuing salience as Britain's finest hour. And as I read my grandfather Shahid's published account, my grandfather Mumtaz's unpublished account, I was so affected by their service. You know, my grandfather Mumtaz writes very frankly about the reason he joined the Indian Army on graduation from King Edward Medical College in Lahore in 1942 was because they offered a stipend that essentially enabled him to have freedom from his family in Multan, to be quite honest. It supplemented his allowance. It gave him the courage that he would be able to marry my grandmother Mary, and if he was cut off by his family for doing so, and certainly emotionally, they found it very difficult, but it would give him a financial freedom. So he joined for those reasons. But his jungle training in what is now Madhya Pradesh, preparing for essentially retaking Burma, Singapore, that was what the army was preparing for in 1942-43. It is absolutely searing to think of what soldiers and medics went through even before they got to the theatre of battle. This is a time before antibiotics. Penicillin has been discovered, but is not in use. So the soldiers he was looking after were dying of dysentery and foot rot and insect bites and the most common infection. And in some ways, they were so frightened of being sent to the front, he wondered whether some of them were almost deliberately exposing themselves to infection because there was so much fear about going into the battle with the Japanese. So he left this very vivid description of, how a Javan who was admitted to hospital was almost certainly going to die because there was really nothing that could be done for them. And the massive effort and awareness in the army, really led by the chief at the time, Archibald Wavell, that it was imperative on all officers to make sure that their soldiers were vaccinated and that all precautions were taken, because at that point more soldiers were dying of disease than were dying of battle. And had that continued, certainly the war could not have been won. And then my grandfather Shahid actually was in Burma and witnessed the fall of Burma, arrived soon after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and witnessed this extraordinary and tragic retreat, because the Japanese were sweeping through Hong Kong and Malaya. Singapore fell in February 1942. And then, of course, Burma fell, and he had a very narrow escape himself. He ended up being airlifted because a doctor spotted he had a very serious eye infection and said, "You're going to lose your eyes if I don't put you on a plane to Calcutta." Otherwise, he would have been part of a terrible, perilous, horrendous retreat and the walk back from Burma to India, which, some of your family probably experienced. So there are these extraordinary and searing events that they witnessed, which in many ways after the war were very swiftly forgotten, because they were replaced by this other huge challenge, which was how to divide India and how to do it with as much law and order as possible. So all of those threads I've tried to join together, because I think the experience of these two world wars were absolutely crucial to what happened politically in India. Looking back, really, India should have become a self-governing dominion after the First World War. It had given so much to the British, and it should have been given self-government or some degree of self-government after the First World War. It should have been like Canada, like South Africa, like New Zealand, like Australia, but that didn't happen.
Well, that's really interesting. You mentioned Auchinleck. You mentioned Wavell. Actually, Wavell is someone I grew up, but he was greatly admired by my family, and Auchinleck also. But they have been more or less marginalized by history. I mean, Auchinleck's role in North Africa, but they didn't get on with Churchill, and that was the end of the story, really, as far as history is concerned. Can you tell us especially about Auchinleck? Because your grandfather was on his staff, and I had no idea till I read your book that Auchinleck even spoke Urdu.
Yes, Auchinleck was an Indian Army officer to his corps. His regiment originally was 1st Punjab, and he came to Pakistan often after independence and maintained his links with Pakistan. And I think he was absolutely broken by what he saw at independence, and was too loyal a servant of the crown to actually resign, but he certainly considered it. When my grandparents, Shahid and Tyra, met him in early 1946 in Delhi, he had decided that he should have an Indian as his private secretary. He already had ADCs who were Muslims. Your Mamu Sahibzada Yaqub Khan was one of those ADCs. But a private secretary was a different kind of person, because that person sees all the papers that pass your desk. And therefore, you make a much bigger statement by putting a native on your staff as a private secretary. But Shahid was the first native to serve in that role. And it meant he did see all the papers. And there were some people who thought it was, including Mountbatten, who thought it was a very dubious thing to have done, that to put not only an Indian, but particularly he took quite a dim view of a Muslim serving as a private secretary to the second most important man in British India. But Shahid and Tyra was very aware that Auchinleck had never been given the due that he deserved for his service in North Africa. Montgomery, who Churchill replaced him with in North Africa in 1942, claimed all the credit for the victory at El Alamein, but really it was Auchinleck's plan. And after the war, Churchill did acknowledge once that when he was asked who was the greatest British general of the Second World War, without missing a beat, he said Auchinleck.
Really, wow.
And yet Auchinleck has been forgotten by Britain.
Yes, he has.
And I think that's largely, and I think there's a lot for journalists to think about in this time. I think that happened because Auchinleck did not do personal PR. And he did not write his memoirs. He did not take the peerage that Mountbatten offered him as a way to sort of soften the blow that not long after independence, Mountbatten made him resign. rather than continue the office of Supreme Commander, which was supposed to divide the military assets of the old British Indian Army fairly between India and Pakistan. Auchinleck was stopped mid-process, and those assets were not divided fairly between India and Pakistan. So there is no doubt that he formed a very close bond with my mother's family, and Tahira says in her tapes, the Orc became a father figure in our lives. Shahid had recently lost his own father. Auchinleck had no children. He was recently divorced. His wife, in one of the scandals of pre-partition Delhi, had left him for a fellow officer. He'd had a terrible time in his personal life, and I think he was very, very fond of Shahid and Tahira and their young children. And in an episode I relate right at the end of the book, Shahid, who had already left Delhi at the end of August 1947, but had left my grandmother Tahira and the 3 children in Simla, thinking, I'll go to Pakistan, I'll set everything up. When things settle down, they'll come to Pakistan. But of course, things did not settle down, and Delhi became a place of great danger for Muslims, as Sahibzada Yaqub Khan and the parents of many people here, and perhaps some of you yourselves, if you were children at the time, witnessed. In fact, you, Muneeza Khala, you were a small child at the time in Delhi.
Yes.
And Auchinleck was the person who essentially sent his ADC, a young Hindu officer called Govind Singh, to Simla to get my grandmother and the children down from Simla. And I remember Tahira telling me about this herself, but I also had her version from her tapes. And it's an absolutely terrifying story, because she said she'd been in this protected cocoon of Simla, summer headquarters of the Indian Army, and as this convoy of vehicles protected by a platoon of infantry drove out, she suddenly realized that a madness had taken hold of the country, because there were men lining the side of the road, and she thought at any moment now this car could be rushed. And then she overheard this young Hindu officer, Govind Singh, saying to her children, my mother Shama was only 2, but saying to the 2 older children, Hassan and Shehnaz, if anything happens to this car, you must say to anyone who asks you that you are Govind Singh's children and that your names are Hassu and Guriya and your little sister is Chutu. And essentially, as all of you will understand, he was thinking, if the adults are not there, the children's best hope is to essentially mask the fact that they're Muslims, and to say that they're Govind Singh's children, and to give their nicknames rather than their full names. And when Tahira heard Govind Singh say this to her children, she realized that even he was afraid that even with a platoon of infantry, if there is a mob, no one has much chance. So I have the letter that Shahid wrote to Auchinleck asking him to look after the children and Tahira, and they stayed in Auchinleck's house, which after independence became Teen Murti Bhavan, Nehru's house. And this was their last home in Delhi. And some of Auchinleck's own staff were saying, the trains to Pakistan are fine now, you can put them on the trains. And Auchinleck said, no, when I go by plane to Rawalpindi, I will take the family with me then. And in an extraordinary coincidence, my father's family also managed to get on an Air Force plane that took them from Delhi to Peshawar, because through the kindness of a British officer who said, for God's sake, don't take the train. They were booked on a train to Lahore and then Peshawar on the 16th of August. Terrible time. And they also ended up on a plane, thankfully. And when they arrived in Peshawar, these are the very, very early days of independence, and there's no system, there's no accommodation. There were only other Air Force officers who were lined up on the runway in Peshawar to greet them, and every family that came off a plane was assigned another officer family who they would stay with and who would look after them. And my grandfather Mumtaz went to air headquarters in Peshawar, and he basically said, I grabbed an office and I put 2 chairs on the veranda, and that was how I established the medical branch of the Pakistan Air Force in Peshawar. That was how simple things were. That was how it began.
Would you like to read something, and then we'll just open out to the Q&A, I think.
I feel I've read quite a lot, so why don't we open to Q&A?
Okay,
and I might come back to some more snippets if I.
All right, let's
if I
open it.
feel like
Any questions? Do we have any questions? Over here, please.
Can you hear me? Okay, madam, my question is, your grandfather was the moving spirit behind the establishment of the ISI, the most reliable intelligence agency at that time. So did he ever share with you some of the events or mysteries related to the Rawalpindi conspiracy case in which the army officer along with General along with Fayed Ahmad Fayed were accused of orchestrating or bringing about a revolution in the country?
that period is beyond the scope of my book because I only in the last chapter do I touch on post-partition events to some extent. But I do want to make clear that moving force is not accurate. Essentially, the setting up of the ISI, every military has intelligence arms within it, and he was given the task in 1948 of setting up this organization. He left it very early on because he wanted to get back to a command and because he said to my grandmother, if you work in intelligence, it makes you suspicious of everyone, and I didn't like I didn't like the thought of what it might do to me. So yes, he was the first the person who set it up in the first place, but it was because it was a job that he was given. I do want to share something since your question relates to the army. I do want to share something which relates again to August 1947. And Shahid, because of his work with Auchinleck, obviously saw Qaid-e-Azam, who he always called the Qaid. He saw the Qaid come in and out of meetings with Auchinleck, and he got to know him a bit. The Qaid was obviously spoke to him. He's one of the prominent Muslim officers of the time. He was still relatively junior as a colonel. And at one point, Shahid became aware that there were many officers of the Indian Army who were opting for Pakistan who had never met the Qaid. And he said to him one day, it would be nice if some of these officers who are opting for Pakistan could meet you. And the Qaid said, what do you suggest? And he said, well, Tahira and I can host a reception and you could come and speak to them. So this gathering took place, and there are photographs of it in my book. And the Muslim officers had the chance to question the Qaid. And one of them asked a question about what were the chances of promotion in the Pakistan army. And the Qaid did not like this question. He said, all promotions will come in due course. But I also want to record other words, because these were recorded by Shahid in his published work. So only once did the Qaid appear annoyed when someone asked about the chances of getting promoted in Pakistan. And Shahid saw him look the questioner up and down before replying, you Muslims, either you are up in the sky or down in the dumps. You cannot adopt a steady course. All the promotions will come in good time, but there will be no mad rush. There was also a warning to those who might believe the new Pakistan army was a route to political power, as the Qaid emphasized that the elected government would be run by civilians. Anyone who thinks contrary to democratic principles should not opt for Pakistan. And in one of Shahid's books, Early Years of Pakistan, he records how these words came back to him in 1958 when he heard the news on the radio that martial law was coming in and that that was what was happening. He said the words of the Qaid came back to me at that point. So I think there's no doubt that the generation that I depict, Mumtaz, Mary, Shahid Tahira, and their contemporaries and peers, you know, they lived with hope and they were part of the foundation of a new country, but they also lived with the reality of seeing the things that did not work out according to their hopes and dreams, and they had to live with that reality.
Thank you so much for that. Any more questions?
Lisa Khala, there's some over there as well.
Oh, I'm sorry. Were they first? Oh, okay. Sorry, after you.
Adnan Hassan. Mishal, that's a very personal and deeply moving narrative which a lot of us who've had family history can relate to. It raises the question about identity also. And I wonder, given the fact that you've so deeply talked about your own family, your own journey, but also you've seen the world, could you say something about the issue of identity in a broader context?
It's very interesting. You know, as as a British citizen, I've always seen myself as the daughter of immigrants, in that my father came to England in 1967, early 1967, in a strange coincidence of fate, just as my grandfather left King Edward Medical College and went straight into the army because it was wartime. My father left King Edward Medical College in the summer of 1965 and went straight into the army because it was a time of war. And he had a short service commission in the Pakistan Army at that time. And then he wanted to fulfill his, professional career, and he considered America and training as a specialist. And then he ended up coming to England and joining the National Health Service. And so I always saw myself as therefore a second generation immigrant in the UK. But when I read this book, when I wrote this book, during the writing, one of my cousins in Islamabad, who live in the house that was my grandmother's last home in Islamabad, put his hand into the back of an old piece of furniture and found a passport and realized it was my grandfather Shahid's first passport that was issued in 1932 when he won a scholarship to Sandhurst to train as a cadet and needed a passport. So this passport was issued in Allahabad in 1932, ready for his travel by ship to England. And in this passport, Shahid's national status is recorded as British subject by birth. And as I looked at this, I thought, gosh, all of my grandparents were actually British subjects by birth.
Yes.
So that means your parents, my grandparents, it sort of makes you realize that was their identity during the Raj. So it makes me think that my links with Britain, in an abstract sense, I knew they went back a long way, but in a concrete sense, I thought they only began with my father. Now I feel much more the interconnection, which is perhaps not that easy to talk about today, but we share a history. South Asia and Britain share a history, and there are many complications to that history, but it is a matter of fact. And my late father, Imtiaz, his last project was to put forward the idea that there should be a memorial in Britain to Muslim soldiers of the two world wars. And it's my great hope that is built one day, because I think in this very testing time for Muslims in many places, including the UK, I think it's really important to have these concrete examples that make people who are Muslim and who are not Muslim think about shared connection and heritage. And that takes many forms. But I really hope that memorial is built. And
That's really good, yeah.
Perhaps some of you will take an interest in it or have heard about it for the first time today.
Thank you so much. There's one more question. Question here, please. I think we're still on time.
Hello. I need to. My question is not related to your book, but I have to ask. When you interviewed Aung San Suu Kyi, and at that moment she said, if you are Muslim, you asked related to Rohingya Muslims question. You asked related to Rohingya Muslims, and she immediately said, if I know you are Muslim, I would never answer your question, and I've never given you an interview. What was that moment where you thought at that moment, and how BBC supported you at that?
So I'm going to just correct one thing, which is that this comment that she reportedly made, and for those of you who are not aware, I think it was 2014 when I interviewed Aung San Suu Kyi, who, if I remember rightly, was on a state visit to the UK at the time. She'd not been free for long. And we were primarily talking about Myanmar, and I think there were elections that were forthcoming. But I was very conscious that I wanted to ask about the Rohingyas. And I didn't want to ask about the Rohingyas because I'm a Muslim, just because I'm a journalist. And it was before the massive exodus that subsequently took place. But it was already clear that people were being burnt out of their homes and were being forced, into exile in Bangladesh. That was happening to a smaller extent than happened subsequently. And I left this question towards the end of the interview, as is often the case with interviewers, when you know you need to ask something that your contributor is not going to like. And I do remember that the atmosphere changed. It's like when you can sort of feel that this sort of chill is descending on the room. So she didn't like the question, and she answered it by talking in terms of a global Muslim conspiracy, which I thought was a, you know, very unfortunate way of describing what were documented atrocities. And I was asking her to comment on those atrocities. But the words that you're quoting, they were not heard by me. I never heard her say anything of that kind, but in a subsequent biography written by Peter Popham, and I don't know who his source was, but she's reported to have said, "No one told me that the journalist was a Muslim," implying that that was the reason I asked this question. So I don't know for sure myself that she said that. I can only describe to you the circumstances around my asking that question, and I'm really glad I asked that question, because I think there were few instances where she's been questioned directly about the Rohingyas. And what happened to them subsequent to that point in time has been truly horrendous. And I've seen it for myself because I've been to the refugee camps near Cox's Bazar, and it's truly tragic. And I looked at those people then, and I thought, I just can't see the circumstances in which you'll be able to return to your homes one day. This is a great ongoing and under-recognized refugee crisis of our times.
Thank you so much. Oh. Any questions over that side? Oh, all right. What? Who's? What? I didn't hear that.
Apparently, Aung San Suu Kyi's had a relationship.
Okay.
May I ask a question?
There's a question over there. We haven't looked at.
Yes.
Can we have a question from
First
there?
of all, thank you for writing this book. I read it and I just loved it. I will say that being a Pakistani, some of the parts in the middle where you talk about the Pakistan movement was very, very familiar and didn't need to be told to me, but I could understand that many other people would need to know about that. But really the part about your own family, and I really appreciate that you were truthful, that you didn't shy from saying the things which may or may not always be complimentary, and I really am very grateful that you wrote this book. My question is, obviously people in India and Pakistan would like to read this book very much. How is it taken by Britishers, and how much do they know, and how much have they been taught about that horrible thing that happened in 1947, in which they had a big hand? Thank you.
I think it is featured very little in British history, and I think that I really hope that the way I've told this story, because I like to think of it as an accessible way to learn about complex history of those times. It's complex because it involves different communities in what was then British India. It involves the relationship with the Raj, and then the Raj itself is a complex beast, you know, earlier times and by this time. And so I really hope that I had to strike a balance in the book exactly between, there'll be parts in this which will be familiar to Pakistanis, not all of it, I think, because there are many instances that have been forgotten even in Pakistan, or are portrayed in a certain way that suits certain narratives. But I definitely wanted it to be accessible to someone in Britain who has no connection with and knows nothing about these times. And my publisher said to me early on, she said, I think you have to explain who Jinnah is, but you also even have to explain who Gandhi is, because a younger generation in Britain don't even know who Gandhi was. So I had to somehow strike this balance between the new readers start here and people to whom, you know, some of this would be familiar. But I like to think that there is a greater awareness, and I think probably largely through British Indians and British Pakistanis trying to make sense of their own heritage, a much wider understanding that these are forgotten aspects of history in the British curriculum and they should be better known. But essentially, much of what I'm writing about between 1945 and 1947 is about the Attlee government. Its actions in the Middle East are under a renewed spotlight, I think, because of present-day events, given that the events in Palestine came shortly after the events I write about in India and Pakistan. But in many ways, there's a dereliction of duty. I think really, I hope that British readers who come to this book will take that lesson away. Mountbatten was in no way qualified to be the man in charge of an incredibly complex political undertaking, which was the exit of the British from India. He did not know the country. He was in a hurry. To some extent, Attlee, the Prime Minister, was also in a hurry because he had a domestic agenda to fulfill and the mandate on which he had been elected, the foundation of the National Health Service and the British welfare state. But Mountbatten was in a particular hurry. He wanted to get back to his naval command. And there's no doubt that I think his royal credentials put this sort of aura around him. Here was a cousin of the king coming to end the British Raj in India. And these are not qualifications for a major job. And I think they were taken for granted at that time. But today we can look at them and say, there was an element of nepotism in this appointment, and that's not something to be proud of.
Thank you so much. That was, we have, almost time is up. We've got time for just one more question. Oh, there's one question here. Just a couple of minutes, I think we have.
Yes. Mine is a very simple question. From the time you started your research for the book, how long did it take you? And the other short question is, whether will you think about writing about Palestine?
I don't know that the book took me about 3 years to write. I will be signing copies of it afterwards at the Liberty bookstall if any of you are interested. And I don't feel I'm qualified to write about Palestine. It's obviously been a part of my working life, particularly over the last year. I think that what I did, however, even though I felt qualified to write this because my grandparents left sources behind, at the beginning, I didn't feel I had many personal sources. I knew that I had my two grandfathers' written works, published and unpublished. I didn't feel I had enough on my grandmother's. And, you know, so often women are written out of the story. And my grandmother, Tahira, knew she had a book in her, but she would say, you know, she would say, if I went off and look at your grandfather, he goes off to sit in his study and write books. If I did that, this house would come to a standstill. And of course, she was completely right. So, but everyone knew she had a book in her. And so I did discover these tapes that my grandmother had recorded. And they are so fascinating because they are in her own words. When she writes about Aligarh, or she writes about Delhi, or she writes about independence, about bringing her parents from Aligarh to Rawalpindi when she finally, after the 1965 war, realized that it would be impossible for her to go back and forth to India. Going back and forth to India in the 1950s was already not a good thing for the wife of an army officer to be seen to do, and it almost certainly affected my grandfather's career. But finally, after the 1965 war, she speaks very movingly of going to her parents and saying to them, and she says, I took 2 suitcases and I packed their bags and I said, my darlings, I can no longer come to you as I have, but, you know, a new stage of your lives is going to begin in Pakistan. And in their, you know, at this elderly stage in their life, she brought them to Pakistan. And she speaks very movingly of that. And my great-grandmother, who I remember, we called her Ammaji, and I remember her in our house in Rawalpindi. And my grandmother says how she was very sort of puritanical in her instincts, a very simple woman, and she was horrified at the excesses she saw in Pakistan. She couldn't understand how weddings could happen with so much expenditure. You know, she said in many ways she was horrified by the excess, the financial excess that she saw in Pakistan. And Tahira wrote, she reflected on her life and the events of those times which had left such a shadow on her own life. So I like to think that I've been true to the people that I've depicted, but I also think that they are symbols of their times. And I hope that the book strikes a chord with many of you, whatever your own circumstances. Thank you, Muneeza Khala, also.
Oh, thank you, Mishal. It's a wonderful book. She's signing copies. I'd say please do buy it because it's just terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's lovely having you here.
Thank you all. Khuda Hafiz.
Dina 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 tin tin tak dina di dina tina di dina tin tak dina tuna katta tak dina din din da din din tak dina katin tak dina